Shalom. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sharon Shafrir from Rochester, New York, co-founder of Hope for Israel Alliance, HIA. Welcome to our Democracy Under Stress webinar. The webinar is in English, so if you need captioning, there is information in the chat for your use. Hope for Israel Alliance, HIA, is a grassroots Zionist movement led by volunteers across the world. We advocate for the people of Israel against anti-Semitism and, most importantly, the campaign for the release of all the hostages held by Hamas. Currently, there are still 59 hostages in Hamas captivity, marking 550 days as hostages, and we will keep fighting for their release until the last one is back home. This webinar is produced by Hope for Israel Alliance and Aid Coalition. Aid Coalition is a US-based not-for-profit organization with the mission to strengthen and preserve the democratic foundation of the State of Israel. Since the events of October 7th, Aid Coalition has managed an administrative platform for dozens of social projects and grassroots operations in North America, such as HIA, as these support and raise funds to rebuild Israel and its communities. These days, as of March 10th through May 4th, the World Zionist Organization is conducting its 5-year elections to its Congress. The WZO, World Zionist Organization, is an umbrella organization that oversees the funds allocations to the Jewish Agency, JNF, and Keren Hayesod, the National Appeal. Aid Coalition is an independent slate for these elections, a collaboration of grassroots pro-Israeli democracy supporters in the US and on the ground in Israel, focusing on influencing the WZO, reprioritizing the vast resources of the world Zionist institutions to rebuild Israel, support Israeli communities, and ensure that these resources are directed where they are genuinely needed. We hope that you will join us in this quest. For more information about HIA, Aid Coalition, and the elections, please follow the links in the chat. So, to our webinar. Today, I'm honored to have two esteemed guests who will talk to us tonight about the erosion of the Israeli democracy. I would like to welcome Noam Gidron, an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and the Joint Program in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research examines the rise of population and polarization across Western democracy. Hello, Noam.
Hi, thank you.
I'd also am welcoming Guy Grossman. He's a David M. Knott Professor of Global Politics and International Relations at the University of Pennsylvania and co-director of Penn's Development Research Initiative. An applied political economist, his research focuses on governance, migration, human trafficking, and conflict processes. Hello, Guy.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for organizing this.
So I think we're going to start with Noam, just to lay the basis of our discussion. So go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Sharon, for this kind introduction. You can see my figures, right?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay, so we are all here because we are concerned about the state of democracy, and I thought we could start with a broad, bird's-eye perspective about the state of democracy today and what we know about it. So let me start with just a couple of figures that try to document the quality of democracy across the globe. And these numbers are taken from the varieties of democracy think tanks that monitors the quality of democracy through all countries. And what we see here is a figure in which higher values denote a higher quality of democracy. And we can see an increase in the number of democracies since the mid-70s till around the early 2000s, with a sharp increase in the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then we see that since the early 2000s, there's a decline in the level of democracy across the globe. And we see a similar pattern whether we put more weight on countries with more population, that's subfigure B, or more territory, or higher economic performance. So we indeed live nowadays in a moment of democratic decline. I would say that there are disagreements between scholars about the magnitude of this decline and how exactly we can measure it, but different indices of democracy, for instance, the Economist Index of Democracy, would provide us with more or less a similar picture. So the last 25 years have been a period of decline in the quality of democracy, and by now we have a better understanding of the processes that lead to this decline. And let me start with a short digression and the story of this weird guy, Prince Heinrich XIII from Germany. This old German aristocrat was arrested for plotting to destroy German democracy, to overthrow democratic institutions and reestablish the German Reich. And this story got a lot of attention in the international news, I think exactly because it is so uncharacteristic of the problems most Western democracies face today. This is an outlier. During most of the 20th century, we used to think that democracies collapse through this type of violent takeovers by political opponents or by military leaders. But we've seen a shift in the threats facing Western democracies since the early 2000s. And currently, the main concern is one of democratic backsliding, which scholars of democracy define as the erosion of democratic institutions by duly elected politicians. So now we are talking about politicians who are already in power, and they use the democratic process to gain power, but then they try to hollow out these democratic institutions that served them before. And here there is no one moment in which we can see the mob taking over democratic institutions, or no one moment in which elections are cancelled. Instead, there's an ongoing gradual process of changing legislation, changing constitutions, reorganizing civil society, taking over media outlets in order to tilt the playing field of democratic competition. So that's very different from the threats democracy used to face in previous years, and in a way, it's also a process that is harder for us to identify in real time, which is why we need to be aware of this concern of democratic backsliding and how it takes place. So this is just a little bit of what we know about threats for democracy today. And of course, we are here because we are concerned about Israeli democracy. So let's zoom in on our specific case. And again, let me take a step back and just show some figures so we are all on the same page. Again, looking at these indicators of democracy based on the varieties of democracy think tank, we see a decline also in the quality of Israeli democracy. Here we are documenting changes in 3 indicators of the quality of democracy in Israel, with higher values again denoting higher level of higher quality of democracy. And we can see already over the last decade a decline in terms of the relationship between the government and the judiciary. And then we can see a steep decline in all 3 indicators of the quality of democracy over this time period between 2022 and 2023. So what happened at that exact moment in time? I'm sure many of us are aware of this, but I think it's important to put this in perspective. On January 2023, less than 1 week after Netanyahu's 6th government was sworn into office, the newly appointed Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, called for a primetime press conference in which he told to the Israeli public, the growing intervention of the court has eroded trust to a dangerous law. This is not a democracy. And then Levin moved to outline a comprehensive multi-layered plan to restructure Israeli democracy. And this plan had many different components that together were intended to weaken the courts and concentrate power in the hand of the government, in the hand of the ruling coalition. And immediately, this plan gave rise to the largest opposition movement in the history of Israel. In fact, it's one of the largest opposition movement, protest movement in the history of Western democracy, exactly because many identified that as a threat to democracy, a case of democratic erosion. Now, when we think about Israeli democracy in comparative perspective, and we focus specifically on the role of the court, there's something important that we should have in mind. When we examine how democracies operate, we can identify several institutional mechanisms that limit the power of the government. Most democracies have a fixed constitution that regulates the relationship between the different branches of government. When we have two houses of Congress, like in the US, we have the House of Representatives and the Senate, each house can be counterweight to the other one. In federal states, the states can push against the federal government, and policy making can be delegated to the states in some instances. And where we have regional elections, representatives are held accountable not only to the leaders of the party, but also to the local voters who can demand certain things and again push them to work against the government in certain instances. Now, Israel stands out exactly because all of these checks and balances are lacking. Israel is a unitary country without a fixed constitution and a relatively narrow list of Bill of Rights. It has one legislative house, the Knesset, with no regional component in its electoral system. So the courts play a crucial role in the system of checks and balance in Israeli democracy. And this is why the fight over the judicial overhaul was so intense, both what the government wanted to achieve and the pushback from the protesters. And I think I'll stop with that, and I'll let Guy take it from here and say a little bit about where we stand at the moment.
Thanks, Noam. Let me just, this was really informative. First, I want to begin by thanking the organizing for putting this together, and I also want to thank you all for joining. There's a lot going on, and now it's a bit hard to keep up to date with all that is happening in Israel and also what's happening in the United States. And so what I'm going to try to do in the next 10 minutes is describe several related processes that are happening now in Israel that should concern those of us who care about Israel remaining a democracy. And I'm going to focus in particular on the following three processes. I'm going to talk briefly about the increasing politicization of the police. I'm going to talk about the recent attempts to remove critical safeguards, critical guardrails responsible for protecting the rule of law. I'm going to talk about the renewal of the attempt by the government to subjugate the judiciary to the executive branch. And if we have time, and maybe we'll just delegate that to the Q&A, we might want to discuss the kind of the widening gap between the government and public opinion in Israel, which I think is also a concern when we think about democratic accountability and responsibility. So let me just start with talking about what's happening in the police. I think if you're on the call, you might know that in January 23, Israel police fell under the control of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was sworn as the Ministry of National Security. We can have a whole webinar about like Ben-Gvir and why he shouldn't be a member of the Israeli government. He has a long history of more than we can say right-wing extremism. I think it goes a lot more than that. He's openly and quite explicitly has no respect to democratic values and institutions. And what he's been doing in the last 2 years is to turn the police to something that looks more like his personal force, personal militia, than a public service. He pushed out officers who didn't fall in line. He promoted loyalists even when they were clearly unqualified. And now we're seeing the result is a lot more police violence against anti-government and anti-war protesters. We see far fewer protection of and presence of police in Arab towns. And quite alarmingly, we see no response by the police to hate crimes that are conducted by West Bank settlers. And the reason we are concerned is, I think this is straightforward. In a healthy democracy, the police force serves the public. In a backsliding democracy is eroding, the police is used to advance narrow, partisan ideological goals. And this is where we're heading. So this is the first process that I wanted to highlight. The second process is the removal of critical independent guardians, which is another alarming recent development. So you may have heard in the past month, Netanyahu government began the process of removing and replacing two of the most important democratic safeguards in Israel that are responsible for protecting the rule of law. The first is Ronen Bar, the director of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency. So that would be kind of like equivalent to the FBI. And the second is Gali Baharav Miara, who is Israel Attorney General. So let's start first with Ronen Bar. So Netanyahu fired him. And he did that after, I mean, the timing is also very important, after the Shin Bet that Bar directs began investigating some serious allegations that top Netanyahu aides were getting like literally millions from Qatar to push its agenda. The Shin Bet has always, as one of, I mean, Israel is a country that faces existential threat, right? And so we always viewed the Shin Bet organization as something that needs to be above politics. But now Netanyahu made it very clear that the next director needs to be loyal to him personally, rather than necessarily the law. He made it very clear that he expects the next director to close down the investigation against people in his top senior advisors. Of course, this has like implications above like whether Ronen Bar will have a job in next week or not. The question is whether an organization that is responsible for sensitive investigations in Israel understands its mission of serving the public or serving the narrow interest of the ruling party. At the same time that Netanyahu is trying to fire Bar, Yariv Lavid, the justice minister, has begun the process of firing Gali Baharav Miara, the attorney general in Israel. For those of you that don't know the kind of all the details, maybe I should say something about the responsibilities of the attorney generals, because they're quite extensive. It's one of the most powerful positions in Israeli politics. It's a 6-year fixed term, and Baharav Miara just added a third year of that term. So the Attorney General in Israel is the head of the prosecution, right? So as head of the prosecution, they have the authority to advance and close criminal indictment. And as you all know, Netanyahu faces several criminal charges. The IG is also responsible to providing the states with legal defense. So when the state is sued and a case reaches the courts, the Attorney General is responsible to putting the defense. So that's another responsibility. But the third one, and might be one of the critical ones for our discussion, is that the AG, the Attorney General in Israel, is also the government's legal advisor. They provide legal opinions. There's some debates on how binding they are. But most legal scholars in Israel view them as quite binding, and they serve a critical safeguard against illegal executive action. So the Attorney General is the one that will come to the government and say, hey, you're planning to do A is illegal. You want to do B? B is something that it will be very hard for me to defend in the courts, because it's against the bounds of what I think is constitutionally appropriate, right? And so the Attorney General in Israel has this dual position where, on one hand, it's supposed to serve the public interest, right? On the other hand, it also sometimes defends the government, right? When case reaches the court. So it's always kind of had to tread this very thin line between, on one hand, representing the government, but on the other hand, representing the public. And that can lead to clashes where you sometimes work closely with the government and sometimes you need to stand up against the government, right? And what the government is trying to do now is to remove that independent safeguard, that independent guardians that can oppose it when it believes it's going over what is constitutionally bound. It's not clear whether the Attorney General, whether the government will succeed in firing Bar and firing the Barav Miara. Both cases are going to reach the Supreme Court. Actually, the Supreme Court is supposed to issue a ruling tomorrow in Israel on the case of Bar. I would just say that it doesn't matter so much how these things shake up. I mean, obviously it matters, but even if the Supreme Court will rule against the government and will force them to keep the Attorney General and the head of the Shin Bet in place, the process itself serves to erode trust in political institution. It will politicize these two roles more than it should have, and reduce. And it also will put the Supreme Court in a very, very difficult situation, ruling against a democratic elected government that says, "Hey, we want to make sure that the people that serve the government, serve in public roles, are aligned with the government." So, however this shakes up, this will not be good for Israel democracy. Let me just end with saying maybe one last thing about the subjugation of the judiciary. Noam mentioned that. That's just probably most people on this call know about the processes that led to the mass protest movement to save Israel democracy after January 2023. I would just say that the big difference between what we're seeing now and what we saw in early 2023 is that the government realized that putting a whole package at the same time in a blitz galvanizes the public. And so what we're seeing now is a lot more of kind of a salami process where they advance one thing after the other, very piecemeal, very kind of like more under the radar. In March 27, for example, the government debated only one aspect of the judicial overhaul, which is about the composition of the committee that appoints judges in Israel, changing the composition in a way that will further politicize the selection of judges and allow the government much more control than previously on who the judges are going to be. So needless to say that if the government is able to control the appointment of judges and subjugate the judiciary to the whims of the majority, Israel will cease to be able to pride itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. Let me stop here. Sharon, you might have questions. There might have been questions from the crowd, and we can continue talking about these issues in the Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Well, first of all, thank you both for this very elaborate educational piece, because I don't remember having such a discussion since the days that I was in high school, covering civic studies and social studies in Israel. I'm taking an amalgam of both the things that you have mentioned. You did say that it's Netanyahu's sixth government. He was sworn in January 2023. And Noam, you did explain that erosion doesn't start, things change not overnight, but gradually. So basically what you're telling us is you're referring to the fact that in his previous governments, and he's been in government for, I think, 75% of the last 20 years, that's when things had started. Do you have any comments on the things that were in place in order to bring it to a situation where a person like Ben Gvir is being nominated as the Minister of Internal Security and the police? Like, so what were the steps prior in the past 20 years?
Yeah, so indeed Netanyahu has been in power for a very long time. I do think that we've seen a shift over the last couple of years in the willingness to challenge some foundational institutions and norms of Israeli democracy. We can point to an earlier point in time where we've seen an effort to monitor, maybe also limit to some degree activities of actors in civil society that have challenged the government. But I do believe that what we've seen in 2023 has been opened a new chapter in the willingness of Netanyahu and his party to push major reforms in how Israeli democracy functions. With regard to Ben Gvir, I think one thing that is important to keep in mind is that the fact that there are radical actors, nativist, far-right actors in the political system is nothing new. And we've seen radical actors in most democratic systems. The question is whether mainstream parties are willing to cooperate with these actors, are willing to give them power, to bring them into the ruling coalition. And that's where we've seen the major shift. That's where the Likud, Netanyahu's parties, have really shifted. It was not that long ago that Netanyahu himself told the Israeli public, that Ben Gvir will not be a minister in his government. But we've seen a shift in the willingness of mainstream right actors to work with Ben Gvir, and I think this is what is mostly disconcerting here.
You also suggested that, and then I'm going back now to Guy, some of the things that you said, that the change now in the way that the government is attacking the democratic system is one step at a side, called the salami system. And under the radar, things are done in a way stealth-like. Now, the radar is the war. We have a war in Gaza. It started with the unprecedented attack on October 7th. And even though it seems like Israel had opportunities to bring back its hostages and also to find a way to utilize regional collaborations and allies to get a stabilized situation in Gaza, it seems like when the rockets are fired, there's more attacks on the democracy, on the Israeli democracy from within. Can you refer to that?
Guy, do you want to take this one?
I mean, I don't know much to say. I think it's quite obvious that and quite intuitive for people that when there's a war going on, it's harder to protest things like democratic institutions, especially things that are procedural. I think there's like two reasons for that. The first one, so I think there's like two things going on. One is like attention span, right? Like, I think I think it's really hard to get the public engaged on multiple things at the same time, right? Like we have a war and there's an anti-war movement, it's quite small in Israel, but it still exists. There's a movement that is bigger, kind of demanding the return of the hostages. They're not exactly there's a lot of overlaps. It's not exactly the same thing, right? And then getting people again out to protest, the firing of the Attorney General, or change to the rules that determine how the committee to select judges is, it's really hard, right? Like there's a lot going on. And not to mention, to add to that, like you have a lot of people that are serving days and days and days, months and months and months as reservists, right? And like, so if you spend like 60 days, 90 days, 120 days a year, as a reservist, then you come home, like it's sort of easy to say, okay, now I'm home for a few days. I'm going to leave my family and go to, to protest. So I think the government is clearly taking advantage of that. We also know from a lot of research that there's a rally around the flag tendency in wars, right? Like, when the country is in war, it's much harder to, it's supposed to be unified. There's a lot of pressure to unity, right? And so the protesters are also portrayed as weakening the country as it faces these like major security challenges. And so all of this together suggests that it's harder for the public to galvanize the way it galvanized in early 2023. And I think it's quite cynical that the government is using the ongoing war as a cover to also re-engage in some of the processes that they halted in respect to the kind of the judicial overhaul. I don't know, Noam, if you want to answer that.
So we know, we read in various surveys in Israel that the majority of Israelis are opposing the war. Most Israelis are opposing the government. Yet there's an argument that this government had won the election and they have the majority in the people, and there are some. I mean, there are at least 25% of the citizens who have voted who support this government. What might be their rationale?
The rationale for, yeah. So somehow paradoxically, because the government is not popular according to the polls they have no reason to go to elections. And the government is supposed to stay. The next elections are scheduled for late 2026, so they have still time. And exactly because the polls are not that optimistic from their perspective, they have no reason. And it seems like actually politically, the government is rather stable at the moment. I do think it's important to know that already before the war started, the judicial overhaul was not very popular in the Israeli public. So it's not just that currently the government is unpopular because of October 7th and the war. Already when the judicial overhaul was announced in January 2023, it did not receive the support of the majority of the Israeli public. And I think that's something important to keep in mind. Actually, we know now that also many of the Likud voters were not supportive of the judicial overhaul. Yes, a majority of them supported it, but not much more than that. So that's just something to keep in mind as we think how this develops.
Yeah, I want to say that there's another process that I think is kind of important that in the background, which is, I know maybe you want to speak about that as well. There's a bit of a change in the landscape, the media landscape in Israel that I think is allowing for a growing wedge between some segments of like the public and the government. I think the government is operating in a very different, and its supporters are operating in a very different media environment that allows it. There's like a kind of a bouncing back and forth between some parts of the media that are extremely supportive of the government and the government that I think is a change in like a qualitative change of what we saw before in terms of like, I think the government is a lot more protected by the fact that we're seeing a big segment of the media environment willing to support the government on things that I think in previous years would have forced the government to fold. I think we're seeing that also in the United States, but we're definitely seeing that in Israel with Channel 14 and Israel Hayom and other like news organizations that are allowing the government to pretend that some of the actions are more popular than what they really are.
Let's also mention the fact that these media channels were created by Netanyahu supporters with the funding, whether it's Channel 14 and whether it's the daily newspaper Israel Hayom. And so we find ourselves, and that's actually, it came into power, it came into existence during the years that Netanyahu, as the prime minister, also had responsibilities and oversaw the Ministry of Communication and public media. So that's all collaborates. Guy, you put in a response to one of our viewers tonight, and would you mind just articulating your comment about the perception of the majority as a majority, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, and something I also wrote about academically. I mean, I think there's part of the problem we're facing goes back to the question of like what democracy is, right? You can't talk about the erosion of democracy without knowing like what is exactly the thing that is being eroded, right? And so I think part of the challenge that we're facing, at least those that care deeply about democratic institution, is that many of us view democracy not just a majority rule, right? We think that democracy should also be maybe the rule of law. Maybe democracy should also entail minority protections to minorities, due process. Like there's a bunch of things that go at the right to protest and freedom of expression, right? There's a bunch of things that will go into the bucket of what we think democracy is. But for a lot of people, the essence of democracy, the real essence of democracy is majority rule, right? You elected, you got the majority of the votes, you were put in place to rule. If people like what you do, they'll re-elect you. If they don't like what you do, they're going to throw you out, right? And so you need to allow the people that got elected to rule, right? And for a lot of Netanyahu supporters, part of the reason they're not objecting to what they're seeing is because they see the Attorney General, Ronen Bar, the judiciary, as an old guard, mostly an Ashkenazi old guard, that is preventing the government from exercising its right to rule, right? And they're viewing this way because that's what they're told, right? Like there's a big machine that is telling them, look, like we are the real Democrats. I mean, that's the kind of like the tool populism, right? If we not to go too much kind of academic talk, but the real idea is like we represent the public, and this is an old guard that is out of touch with the public, that is preventing us from representing the will of the kind of like the will of the people. And it doesn't matter that like if you look at public opinion polls, a lot of the things that they do are not popular with the people. Because you can also redefine who are the real people are. You might say, well, when we think about the people, I don't care about what the Arabs say, because the Arabs are not the real people in Israel, right? Like, or Ashkenazis in Tel Aviv, they're not the real people, right? The real people are the people that, and so we see this is a very effective attack, and try to explain why you need to put safeguards on the right of the majority to rule. Is exactly what we're doing here, but it's a complex argument, right? It's much easier to say, I was elected, I'm prevented doing what I was elected to do. That's, and so I'm going to remove these obstacles because the people wanted me to do the things that I am trying to do and I'm prevented.
So
can I just add to this point that we've seen this debate about the rule of the majority in real time in early 2023, when Netanyahu was saying that the courts are wrong because they refuse to accept majority rule, and then Chief Justice Hayut responded saying that democracy is not just majority rule. So I think we've actually seen this debate in real time. And we know from research we conducted that people who think that majority rule is at the core of democracy were more likely also to support the judicial overhaul. But we should also keep in mind two things. First, even among supporters of this government, people who voted for the coalition parties, there are different perceptions of democracy. This political bloc is not a monolith, and different people there think differently about democracy. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing I wanted to mention is that most people do not spend too much time thinking in such abstract terms about democracy. We probably enjoy it, which is why we are here in this webinar, but most people do not spend so much time just thinking, oh, what does democracy mean? And we see when we analyze the data that the strongest drivers of support for the judicial overhaul among right-wing voters wasn't so much their abstract ideas about democracy, but rather they really like Netanyahu, they are emotionally attached to him, or they really dislike the left and the center parties. That is, they were effectively polarized. So I think that it's important to think about all of these democratic values and how people debate about them and reason about them. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that this is where the engine of support for the judicial overhaul lies.
I agree, Noam, but it's also the case that that is the argument that they're making,
Eventually,
right?
you'll
Like that's
have
the
to let me
that's
ask
like
a
the
question.
argument. Yeah. That's the argument that they're making, right? They're making Netanyahu makes this argument, Trump is making this argument, Orban has made this argument, Maduro is making this argument. So I agree with you that like the charisma of the leader matters immensely, right? I agree with you that the likability matters immensely. Like if you're charismatic and you can, you know, people will be like, okay, if that's what you're saying, I agree. But at the end of the day, you have to say things that like resonate with people's intuition, right? And I think we need to take seriously these lines of argument, because that's what is used, and you need to have a counter argument if you want to succeed in galvanizing opposition to what we're seeing now.
So actually, going back to educating ourselves and being more conversant in understanding what democracy is and identifying it, brings me back to the notion that, in Israel, as well as in the United States and other places in the world, living under the idea of we're living in a democratic country puts many into some kind of slumber, civic slumber, or complacency. Now, in Israel and in the United States, there's something called gerrymandering that helps the parties have better control of certain voting regions, etc., and it can have an impact on the local, on the state, and on the national level. In Israel, we have what we call the threshold percentage, and in the past couple of decades, especially in the last decade, under Netanyahu and right-wing parties, we've seen how this more legislation of the threshold percentage has been affecting the smaller parties, the parties that represent minorities, either ideologist or minority ideology, or an ethnic minority. And that ties it to another question that someone asked here about the 2018 national law, making it very difficult for those who are not Jewish to exercise their rights as citizens from day-to-day lives to being actually have a say, have a vote in the Knesset. So I don't know if exactly I'm asking you a question or just want your comment on that.
I can say that in research I conducted together with Professor Netta Barak-Koren from the law school in Jerusalem, we saw that the nation law indeed affect how Arab citizens of Israel perceive their political efficacy. Even if even if the law had no direct impact on certain aspects of their political participation, they still perceived it as having a detrimental effect on the ability to participate in the political process. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. That being said, the relatively high threshold that we have today can be a problem for one group, and in the next election could be a problem to another group. So it's not clear that it necessarily tilts the political playing field in one direction or the other. Focusing specifically on Arab representation in the Knesset, there's of course the question of how the Arab parties decide to organize their own political bloc. and whether they cooperate, run together, or separately. And that's something that's, of course, closely related to the electoral threshold, but also a question of how they decide to organize their vote. Yeah, Guy.
Yeah, can I say something about that? So I think I think there's something kind of deep in the sense that, for everything that we kind of mentioned, you can go to another country and say, hey, look, Germany has like a 5% threshold. It's actually much higher than Israel even, right? Like, and it served the purpose of trying to make sure that like really extreme parties, that have, don't like enter parliament, right? Israel is even lower than that, right? If we talk about the judicial overhaul and we mentioned the politicization of the appointment process, people will point to the United States and say, hey, in the United States, completely, the process is completely politicized, right? It's the president, like, that appoints like judges, right? So why are we worried about like small changes to the composition of the committee in Israel? And my answer is usually you can't kind of go to like other places and, and kind of pick one institution, say, hey, without looking at the whole picture of the constitutional order that we have, goes back to something that, that Noam mentioned before. Germany has a constitution. They have, they have two houses. They have a mix of proportional representation, and it's a federal system. They have a mix of proportional representation and direct voting. They have all these other guardrails that in place. In the United States, we have a Senate that confirms judges, and historically they sometimes like didn't confirm judges that were like too extreme, and so I think the what we're facing now in Israel is like for every one thing that happens, you can find another country that does something kind of similar and justify it on these terms, but when a lot of things are happening at the same times in different domains where we have to begin with a relatively weak set of protections, then the story becomes much more alarming.
A question that I know I was going to ask at the end, but it also popped up again. We're having this conversation now where we're educating our listeners, we're educating ourselves about what is democracy, what is Israeli democracy, and where the erosion started and how it affects Israel. And I would like to ask you what you think it may impact, what kind of impact it will have on Israel's future as a Jewish state, as a Jewish home, and also on its relationship with the diaspora.
Maybe I'll start. Maybe I'll say something about the diaspora, and Noam can say something about Israel as a Jewish state. So this also goes back to a question that we had in the chat, I think from Yair Lev, that says, talks about the fact that a lot of people say we shouldn't have these conversations here in the United States or in other diasporas about what's going on in the Israeli government, because the government is, elected democratically. And so who are we to kind of like speak against that? So my answer to that is always separating the government from the state, right, from the country, right? I think a form of patriotism and love is to try to correct when you see something that goes astray, right? Like for the last 20 years I've lived in the United States. I'm now an American citizen. I care deeply about the United States, but I think part of the caring deeply about the United States is also criticizing the government when I think it's wrong-headed, right? I don't think that criticizing the government is a form of betrayal. I think criticizing the government is a form of civic engagement, and actually it's a form of love. Right? It's a form of I care enough that I spend part of my free time instead of going to the beach to be on such webinar, right? Like it's a form of love. And I think very intuitively Americans see that when they're thinking about their own government, right? Like they can criticize the Bush government for going to the war in Iraq, and they don't see that that's a problem, right? Like, that And I think something like that we should think also when we're thinking about the Israeli government, right? Like uh, it's not a form of disloyalty. It's not a form of, you're not a safe-hating Jew and you criticize the government, because we have an interest to correct the government to ensure that Israel is a thriving democracy, because it's our interest also as a diaspora to make sure that we have a place, a safe haven to Jews. I think it's still important. Like, both of my parents made Aliyah. My father was a Holocaust survivor. I grew up like believing, and I still believe that like uh, uh, strong democratic Israel is important, because when that is in place, we are more protected also when we are overseas. If Israel stops being a haven, then we will be attacked more wherever we live across the globe. And so I think that we have a duty and we have a right to try and change course, and we do that out of love, not out of contempt.
Great. Noam, do you want to add to that? No? I want to add something really important. And I do want to say, well, thank you, Guy, because you really articulated what I and many other Israeli expats and Jews around the world feel about Israel. We criticize not because we really enjoy being right or wrong, but or just for the debate. It's because we care, because we love the country. Israel is the only country in the world that its diaspora began before the state of Israel was established. So let's not forget that the diaspora has been around for 2,000 years before Israel. And it was a team effort. People made aliyah to that piece of land to build that safe haven, and people on the other side of the ocean had raised funds and engaged in diplomatic and legal conversations in order to make it be. And so it's a team effort. I want to remind everybody, I'm really using this this last piece of conversation to remind everybody that the elections for the World Zionist Organization are now really at their peak, and it's important that you do vote. We have a mandate. We have a share in this family company called the Zionist um, state in Israel. And whether we live in Israel and do whatever we can in Israel, and wherever we live outside of Israel, this is an opportunity to impact the conversation and the handling of funds funneled to Israel and to the Jewish diaspora. So please vote. Aid Coalition, and I'm sorry that I'm jumping here with some information again, but Aid Coalition is on the ballot. We're number 14, and we support pluralistic, democratic Israel with a focus specifically on prioritizing the funds to support rebuilding Israel in the next few years. Let me see if there's anything else that people wanted to ask us. Or would you like to add anything else, Noam or Guy?
No, I just want to thank the organizers for putting this together. I want to thank the people that joined us. There's a lot, as I said, there's a lot going on, and, committing an hour for things that are happening thousands of miles away. I'm always, overwhelmed by that. It's really heartwarming, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us, for great questions on the chat, and and I hope that this is an ongoing conversation.
Yes, I think educating ourselves about what is democracy is something that is not limited to school classroom and to a certain age. We all have to be educated, and not via TikTok, as someone here suggested, and not through social media, but to have serious conversations, rely on serious research, information, and look for reliable pieces of information that are not just someone's opinion flying through the Ethernet. And lastly, I really appreciate everybody's conviction that it's important to listen to this webinar. So those of you who joined us, and we had nearly 100 people on the webinar today, thank you all. Thank you, Noam, and thank you, Guy, and have a good night or day wherever you are on this globe. And thank you,
Thanks,
everybody
everyone.
else. And there will be a follow-up email with this information and with a recording of this webinar, which you are most welcome to share. And any other questions you can address to Hope for Israel Alliance at gmail.com, as was mentioned in your registration form. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.